So one affirmative area that you might get interested in exploring, or that you might want to be ready for on the negative, is what to do about the U.S. Postal Service. And there are a lot of wrinkles on this, both sides. What can you do topically? What are the negatives options? So we can begin by saying that the U.S. Postal Service is in trouble. They are handling the changes brought on by the internet and by changing business models in a lot of areas of the economy rather poorly. In the 10 years ahead of us, they are projected to run a deficit of almost $250 billion. So how to stay afloat and how to stay stable is a big issue. The United States Postal Service is one of only two government agencies whose existence is laid out in the text of the Constitution, the military being the other. And then in 1971, though, the Postal Service is set up originally was entirely a government agency, and for a long time the Postmaster General was a member of the cabinet, the President's cabinet. But in 1971, laws were passed to reorganize the U.S. Postal Service to make it an independent agency that had to show a profit, that Congress, that the federal government would have limited responsibility to subsidize. And they've been trying ever since then to run it like a business and to keep it in the black every year. But the problem is the United States Postal Service is required to deliver to every address in the United States, and it's required to deliver the mail 6 days a week. And within those constraints, it's really, really hard to run a business in a way that's profitable. Now, I think if you're negative, you could say that there are a couple of ways of going about saying that it's not topical, that the 1971 laws, the 1971 postal reorganization was intended to separate the Postal Service from the federal government. It still has a relationship with the federal government, but calling it part of the federal government's a misnomer. I think on the affirmative, you'd have an easy time answering that, saying that it is laid out in the text of the Constitution that even if they did adjust what its relationship was, there's still no mistaking it for anything but a federal agency. The sort of second line argument that I think you could make on the negative is to say that even if the Postal Service has a necessary relationship to the federal government, it's not the case that revenue raised by the United States Postal Service is federal revenue, because that money stays internal to the post office's budget and operations. And I talked in one of these previous videos about there's a ruling in Texas State Court under Texas law, which I know is not generally applicable, but you can make the argument this is a good interpretation for the sake of making a good debate happen. In Texas law, sources of funding are not called revenue if they're already earmarked for a specific purpose. The case that I ran across when trying to find a definition of revenue generation, or even just a good definition, a good useful working definition of revenue, was that money from the Texas lottery was not to be considered revenue because it was set aside to go to education. I think you could make the argument that because any revenue the United States Postal Service brings in, it doesn't go into the pot for the federal government. It's not fungible. It can't be put to any other purpose than running the United States Postal Service. You could say that that is not the federal government reforming its revenue generation policies, because the revenue is not federal revenue, it's Postal Service revenue. And that other sources of revenue, the funds that come in, they are available, can be reallocated, can be redirected in a way that Postal Service revenue can't be. Now, I have to say here, and I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning, the reason I got interested in this in the first place is if you go looking for the phrase revenue generation, you're going to be looking for a while. You're going to find some references to that term in countries other than the United States. You'll find some references to the term. One thing that I ran across was colleges talking about which of their athletic programs were revenue generating. But the U.S. Postal Service uses exactly that phrase, and I think you could say in your affirmative topicality defense, the fact that it is the only agency with a relationship, a formal relationship to the federal government, the only one with direct oversight by the federal government, direct accountability to the federal government, that actually in its documents talks about revenue generation. And you can find plenty of Government Accountability Office reports talking about revenue generation at the Postal Service, what can be done about it. I think that's probably some good grist for an affirmative topicality defense. So where do you begin in writing the case? Well, one of the things I think you could say is, based on the hole in their finances, one of the things that the Postal Service has started the process of doing is closing down post offices in rural communities. Now, you'd have to go digging for this, and I'm not sure whether you would find the goods to make this argument, but this certainly would be what I was looking for if I was trying to develop this affirmative. It's easy to find evidence that the Postal Service in a lot of the outlying rural communities, that it is the center of the community. It's where all the members of the community come together. It's where the gossiping happens. It is the fabric of the community. And I think if you dug a little into the sociological literature, that you could find evidence that big city and even suburban living is these days all about alienation and all about the watering down and the dissolution of American values. And I think you could probably put together a good systemic argument that it is in the rural communities and the small towns that a lot of what made America great and a lot of what's virtuous about us, that's where it's kept alive. And just think about what a rhetorical advantage you would have in selling that argument to your judging pool. That would be an argument people just want to be true. So I think you could say that if your plan was a way of fixing the Postal Service's finances to where they didn't have to close the rural post offices, that it would have the effect of maintaining the social fabric of the United States and maintaining some of its basic, fundamental, traditional values. Some other arguments you could make: there are a lot of law enforcement functions carried out by the Postal Service. There are people who try to send letter bombs. There are people who try to use the Postal Service to deliver drugs, to deliver other kinds of contraband. And I think you would have a pretty easy time finding if the Postal Service is having to cut its budget back to the bone, then that's having to come out of the inspectors, and the law enforcement functions are going to suffer. And assuming that this is an affirmative that won't link to a lot of the negative strategies, that might actually be enough harm to get you bang for your buck to where you can outweigh some of the arguments the negative will make against you. So what do you do for a plan? Well, there are a few directions you can go. As I said before, there are a number of GAO reports that propose reforms to help the Postal Service. Senator Tom Carper of Delaware has proposed within the past couple of months, I think he did this in May, a bill to reform the Postal Service, and there are a long list of things in it. One of the things that you'll have a little bit of a challenge defending or figuring out what you want to do, what's strategic, is a lot of the proposals that are made about how to fix finances with Postal Service involve cutting costs in one way or another, restructuring, reorganizing how money is spent. And probably that's not topical. I mean, right off the top of my head, it seems to me that that's hard to defend as revenue generation. You might say, well, no, I can't even think of a bad argument for defending that. Now, some of the proposals, in particular in Tom Carper's bill, there's a proposal to allow the Postal Service to deal in non-postal products, which has been prohibited. The Postal Service in the United States cannot do business in things other than what is strictly necessary to send things through the mail. In a lot of other parts of the world, that's simply not true. In Japan, for example, what's very common is people will keep their savings account at the post office. So you're out running your errands, you pick up your mail, you also do your banking. So that's probably the most topical thing you can do to try to fill in the hole in the Postal Service's finances. The problem is, I think you're going to be very hard-pressed to find an advocate who says that just fixing the revenue generation end of the problem is enough. You might possibly be able to make the argument that the political will for reorganization is going to take a while to come together, and new sources of revenue can bridge until that political will happens, and that I think you leave yourself open to the negative, saying that a new source of revenue is actually a whitewash, to where they wouldn't go through the restructuring and reorganization because it's the pressure of the hole in their finances that's actually driving them to do it right now. But, maybe in your research you'll find evidence that you could answer that with. So it's a tricky little affirmative, because there's the question of what you can topically do that can address the harms, but it would take you off in a slightly different direction. Now, as far as negative strategies, there are a surprising number of people who make some pretty fervent arguments that the Postal Service ought to be privatized. That Rick Geddes is an economist at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and he's written a lot about the problems with the Postal Service being a monopoly. The problem with that, though, is, as I said at the beginning of this video, the fact that the federal government can require the Postal Service to deliver anywhere that there's a postal address at any rate, and that the Postal Service has to deliver 6 days a week. I think that anyone who adopts this for an affirmative, that they can come up with some pretty compelling disadvantages to privatizing the Postal Service. but it's something that you could go to a limited set of authors, do some limited searches, search for U.S. Postal Service and monopoly, U.S. Postal Service and privatize, and then just go and find some of the writings of Rick Geddes and see who he's footnoting, and you could come up with some pretty good arguments for actually, dissolving, taking down the role and the involvement of the United States Postal Service, and that could be a pretty straight-up negative strategy. Instead of propping this thing up, we should let its financial problems become so severe that it falls apart on its own. So, I don't know. Those are some thoughts as to how you could go in that direction, and even if the affirmative doesn't sound appealing to you, it's something you don't want to be caught off guard by, because it is certainly in a period of tumult right now, and it's going to be tempting to somebody. And maybe we haven't happened upon the strategic twist just in these early thoughts. Maybe we haven't come upon what the particular case harm will be that's a big round winner, although I think that rural communities one could actually be pretty potent if you find the right sources and the right authors who take that as kind of the direction of their career research and their passion and so forth. But have it somewhere on your list of priorities, on your list of things to take care of, because I suspect you'll hear about it at some point during the season.